Well, I finished up a knife project recently, and this is one of those ones that I wanted to make for a long time, and thought about it for quite a while and finally got around to it. And just finished it the other day. This is my attempt to recreate what I think is undisputably the most significant knife in American knife history, which no one has ever heard of. It's been pretty much forgotten about for the most part. And it's known to us only by a description. The original knife is long lost to history, but this is my interpretation of what is known about that knife. This is my recreation of the knife that Jim Bowie had at the Vidalia sandbar fight, which is what made him famous and made everyone want a knife like he had, which kind of evolved somewhat over time. As you can tell, without even taking this out of the sheath, it's quite a bit different from what is generally considered to be a Bowie knife today. So the backstory on how this knife came to be, the original one, is that the Bowies had a plantation in this town, and all of these accounts and stories vary to an extent depending on where you're reading it from. Sometimes it's hard to even pin down what state some of these things are occurring in. But in this town, the Bowies were involved in local politics, and they were two main factions. And this was a pretty violent place and time in history. And the politics and disagreements between these two factions pretty frequently resulted in fights and duels and murders and all kinds of things. So on this one particular day, James Bowie was about town and ran into his arch nemesis, who was named, I believe, Norris Wright, who also was the sheriff of the town. And in the altercation that ensued, Wright pulled a pistol, and depending on where you're getting the story from, one of those things again, he either shot Bowie or shot at him. It's hard to tell for sure if he actually hit him. Some accounts say that Bowie shot back or tried to shoot back with his own pistol, which misfired, and this would have been in 1826, I think, so we're talking about muzzle-loading pistols here, possibly even flintlocks. But in any case, because of this incident, James Bowie decided that from that point on he would carry a knife to defend himself. So his brother, Rezin Bowie, went about procuring a knife for him to carry to defend himself with, and he went to the blacksmith on the Bowie plantation, who was a man named Jesse Clifft. And Rezin Bowie apparently directed Clifft in making this knife, and told him the kind of knife that he wanted. And this description is now pretty much the only thing that's known about this knife, and I believe it comes down from a newspaper article that was written some point several years later, in which Rezin Bowie was interviewed and gave this description of the knife. And he said that it was a big butcher knife, which at the time just meant a big knife. It didn't refer to any, specific pattern or shape of knife like it does today. Just a big knife with a blade 9.5 inches long, 1.5 inches wide, 1/4 inch thick, with a straight back and no clip point and no hand guard, and with a handle made of oak scales. So that is what I've put together here to the best of my ability with the information and materials that I had available. And I think I pretty well matched all of those dimensions. Full tang with the oak scales. Oh, it's already zoomed out. A little hard to keep the whole thing on screen, it's so big. But that is pretty much the knife that James Bowie had at the Vidalia sandbar fight. You could say the original Bowie knife. And I went with kind of a rustic look with a forged finish. One thing I forgot to mention was that in that original description, it also included that the knife was forged from a file, which I would have liked to have done just to keep it as accurate as possible to the original, but I couldn't come up with a file that was big enough to meet the dimensions of the blade and to be able to forge out a full tang, so I just used my typical 1080 steel stock that I keep on hand. So it has that forged finish. I forged it very close to shape and just did the minimal amount of grinding to put still a pretty wicked convex edge on there, and then etched the blade in ferric chloride to get that dark finish. And I also even on the tang, that all got filed and sanded bright from shaping the handle, but I went back over that with some cold blue and blued it so that it matches that dark blade, and it actually matches pretty well. And the sheath, really nothing is known at all about it, but I just made a pretty basic sheath there, which actually probably is not very similar to sheaths that were made in the 19th century, which are kind of odd to me. I don't know what the deal was with sheaths back then, but they all typically were very thin. Leather goods in general, even the surviving ones that still exist from back then, are all very thin and not very rugged looking. I don't know why they were done that. You think if there were tougher ones made, those would be the ones that would have survived. But for some reason, you don't really see them like that. But anyways, this is made out of my typical 8 to 9 ounce leather, good and thick, and covers the handle by a couple inches or so to hold it in there. So the famous sandbar fight, the thing that happened with that was it was again one of these eruptions of violence that occurred from the local politics at the time, and wherever it was that these people all lived, dueling was actually illegal at the time. So they would cross the Mississippi River, I believe, into Louisiana, where dueling was legal. Maybe it was the other way around. I kind of forget. I'm mainly just interested in the knives, and I did all this research quite a while ago for making this. But anyways, this duel occurred on what was at the time a sandbar on the Mississippi River. The river has since actually shifted by several miles, so the exact spot is still known, but the river isn't even there anymore. And Bowie was actually not even one of the main participants in the duel. They were the two guys, I forget what their names were, but then there were a party of people that came to to back each side and to witness the duel, which ended pretty uneventfully with each of the two guys firing a couple of shots at each other and missing, and then he decided that was good enough. But then the two parties of people on each side broke out into a brawl, in which one guy was shot and killed pretty much immediately, and then Bowie was attacked by a number of people, including his nemesis, Norris Wright. And Bowie was shot 3 times, I think, and stabbed a number of times, and was very nearly killed. But he grabbed a hold of Wright and pulled him down to the ground and fairly well gutted him with that knife. And then cut a chunk out of another guy's arm, and that was the end of the fight. And in the first newspaper reports of this incident at the time, it was reported that Bowie was actually not even expected to survive, but he did, of course. And it was such a wild and sensational story that he became a national celebrity because of this, and everyone wanted a knife like the one that he had. And the idea of what that knife is, of course, kind of changed over time. The thing is, none of the knives associated with Jim Bowie actually were his own invention or particularly unique at all at the time. You know, there were knives like this. There are knives of the more typical Bowie type that we think of today, with the double guard and a clip point blade, actually going all the way back to the 1700s. But Bowie had a number of different knives made, many of which he gave to people as gifts. One of the more famous ones, which is still in the hands of a private collector, is called the Forrest Bowie, because he gave it as a gift to a famous actor at the time whose name was Forrest. I forget his first name. And that actually is a very similar pattern of knife to this, same kind of shape. I think it may actually be a somewhat larger knife, but it's also a very much more nicely made knife, made by a professional knife maker at the time. Whereas the original one, you know, the reason I kind of went with a really rustic look and the forged finish is because it was made by a blacksmith. And blacksmiths generally, even as now, are not typically knife makers. Obviously they can make a knife, but not typically to the same level of you know, finish and everything as someone who is a dedicated knife maker. You know, blacksmithing is more, it's more generalized. Also, I will admit, you know, as a bladesmith myself, being a more general blacksmith, the forging involved is much more skilled. And I'm sure, you know, the original knife made by Jesse Clifft probably would have been you know, more cleanly forged than this even, and also would have had a cleaner finish, because a coal forge gives a less scaled and corroded surface finish than a propane forge does, because the propane creates water vapor as it burns, which makes it more corrosive. But it still came out pretty good anyways, I think. I like the forged finish when it comes out well, which I think this did. But later on, as I was saying, Bowie did have you know, other knives made with the big double guard and the wide clip point blade. And the knife that he had at the Alamo when he died was probably of that type, you know, which he became known for. And when the Bowie craze really took off, most of the Bowie type knives, ironically, were from Sheffield, England, imported because of the massive demand for Bowie knives, which ironically ended up being quite a bit different from the original one, which Bowie actually used when he became famous in that famous fight. So that's kind of interesting if you're really into knives. You know, it's a big piece of knife history, and there's actually not a lot of these around. Not many knife makers make them. You know, people have made them, of course. It's but you don't even really see that many custom makers. Oddly enough, if you look up, a Jesse Clifft knife or something like that, you'll come up on eBay with a version of this which is mass produced in Pakistan, and in my opinion is quite overpriced for a mass produced knife from Pakistan. But if you're interested in one of these, this one is for sale. I'm asking $200 for it. If you're interested, send me an email at knifemaker84@gmail.com. And I have a few other knives around also, which maybe I'll make another video of next. But there's that one anyways. So thanks for watching.